Greetings, welcome to the Evidence and Reasons for the Christian Faith video channel. Tonight's just going to be a casual Friday night. I'm joined here by Professor Joel Duff. Many people know me as a Young Earth Creationist because I am, and Joel Duff does not share that view. But we are meeting under what I call a flag of truce. And the thumbnail I showed, let me show it here. It really is kind of touching. It's one of the, while we're waiting to get more viewers, I can kind of just go off on a history tangent here. The Battle of Antietam was considered the single bloodiest day in American history as far as battles go. I mean, if it's not the single bloodiest, it's pretty close as far as a day. Now, the Battle of Gettysburg, which was spread over like 3 days, was probably worse in total casualties, but for a single day's battle, it was the Battle of Antietam. And so this colored drawing was actually from a black and white pencil that was taken by a reporter who rendered the meeting and his impressions. And you could see there the Union soldier in blue and then the Confederate soldier in gray. And behind the Confederate, officers, behind the Confederate officer is someone holding a white flag, a flag of truce. And so these people, they decided, they said, hey, we have so many wounded just lying on the battlefield, a lot of them dead. Shouldn't we have a chance to just bury each other's dead? Let's just kind of stop killing each other for a while and just try to honor the soldiers. So this is a very touching moment when they, here are the guys that were just like within the last 24 hours shooting at each other. They come and meet, and then they shake hands under a flag of truce and said, hey, for a moment, we're just going to be, we will work toward a common cause and, care for our dead and wounded, our fallen comrades. And it's kind of touching because the accounts were that the soldiers of both colors started to mingle. In other parts of the Civil War, they would exchange coffee and tobacco, and I, this is how I'm kind of approaching this discussion tonight. And I just do want to share something also interesting, both in Civil War history and also Christian history. This is the story of Joshua L. Chamberlain, one account by him. And unfortunately, when I tried to expand this, I lost what I was looking for. Okay. Joshua Chamberlain was a Union general, famous Union general, decorated with the Congressional Medal of Honor for his performance in the Battle of Gettysburg. He was outnumbered, running out of ammunition, and he led a charge downhill against the larger force and overtook them and probably saved the Battle of Gettysburg. And for that, he won the Congressional Medal of Honor. He's a very devout religious person. He was a professor of natural and revealed religion. As far as I recall, if I get my facts wrong, feel free to correct me. And this is an interesting passage by Chamberlain. In September 1862, Chamberlain and the other soldiers of the 20th Maine were stationed near Sharpsburg, Maryland, cited the bloody Battle of Antietam. The 20th Maine was never ordered into battle, but the troops saw plenty of evidence of war's terrible toll. Chamberlain recalled that the sight of one dead Confederate soldier holding a Bible in his lifeless hands haunted him for the rest of his life. I saw him sitting there gently reclined against the tree. This boy of scarcely 16 summers, he stated. His cap had fallen to the ground on one side, his hand resting on his knee. It clasped a little testament opened at some familiar place. He wore the gray. He was my enemy, this boy. He was dead, the boy my enemy. But I shall see him forever. And so this this particular account kind of just strikes home. Christians, we're obviously Dr. Joel and I are not going to be anywhere near um, kind of the ferocity of the fights that were there. But throughout the history of Christendom, we often had Christians fighting on different sides in different uniforms. And, there has to be a time of peace and cooperation at some point. And in God's eyes, probably one party is closer to the truth or righteousness than the other, or maybe sometimes both are bad. Uh, and it just happens. And so people who profess our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ will often, not just sometimes, have fierce disagreements. And my hope was that um, because I'm a graduate student, have been a graduate student, still fancy myself as a graduate student, a lot of the people watching this channel are thinking, are graduate students themselves, or thinking about becoming graduate students. And um, one thing you're going to find, if you're a young earth creationist, you're going to have to matriculate through secular schools. And um, having a chip on your shoulder is not going to serve you well. You're there to learn. And so I said, there might be professors like Dr. Joel who doesn't share young earth creationist views. And individuals like him will be your professor. And so this is a great chance to hear someone who would represent the sort of people you'll learn from. For myself, and I get flack for saying this, Dr. Sanford, who was my boss, paid out of his own pocket to send me to secular schools. He sent me to learn creationism from people that are evolutionists. He didn't send me to Dinosaur Adventureland. He sent me to the NIH to learn. And so, with that, this is a chance for you guys who, there are a variety of camps there that visit YouTube. There's some people that just like to thump their chests. This channel is for people that are interested in going off to school to study science, and it's going to be a very different environment than the shouting matches in the internet. And so I hope that I can help. This is an opportunity to give you perspective from the professor's side, and maybe you'll get some ideas of how to conduct yourself and succeed and give honor and glory to God. Whatever your views about origins are. So I felt that would be one thing I think we could take away from this discussion. We're going to minimize kind of what our differences are tonight. So we're gathering under a flag of truce to hope we can help the viewers who are watching us live and in recording to come away with something beneficial. So Dr. Joel, please feel free to introduce yourself. And, I said I'm a young earth creationist. You're welcome to also state your views just for the record.
Well, first, Sal, I want to say, I thank you for inviting me on. I really appreciate the chance to talk to you. We've been back and forth on chats, and we've briefly talked through email and kind of gotten to know you. But I view this also as a time, even though it's live in front of everybody, as a chance for us to get to know each other better. And I've just really appreciated your delving into the data and being willing to expose yourself to the evidence of God's world, right? I mean, God's creation. We were told, that we are to have dominion over this world, but we were to understand it, to name it, right? To name the creatures. I view our responsibility to identify and bring glory to God. Everything that we do to understand His creation is bringing more glory to God. And you're attempting to do that. I'm trying, I'm attempting to do that because that's what we have in common, right? We have a common Savior. We have a common goal in mind, and we have a common desire for mankind in kind. And although we may differ on our views of interpretations of God's word with respect to Genesis, we have a tremendous amount in common in terms of our faith values and history and our commitments to that. And so, yeah, I thought we should we should talk about some of those things. And I would really love to hear more of your story. I've heard it. You've sprinkled in a lot of different parts of your history, and I thought that maybe I would share a little bit of my history, like how I came to be in this particular position, both with my faith, but also as a scientist. And as you alluded to, kind of getting into, hey, I'm a scientist working at a secular institution. What are the challenges of working at a secular institution as a Christian? And I'm not hiding my Christianity here. It's not like my colleagues don't know that I'm a Christian. They're fully aware of my particular views and so forth. And so how does that sort of how does that work in the classroom, and how do students interact with that? And I don't know, I have I can start out with a story because it's fresh on my mind, because we just finished up the semester, right? So I'm finishing up the semester. In one of my classes, I had several honor students, and as part of the honor student thing, where they sort of tack on an honors section to the course, they just have to do an extra assignment. In this case, I asked them to write a paper. I said, I want you to write a paper on something you found really interesting in the course that you want to delve into further, applying the course material to that, and then get it to me by the end of the semester. And I kind of said I would do this for a few of the students I knew were really good students, and then I kind of forgot about it, right. The semester's busy, and of course they procrastinated. They waited till after spring break, and then I'm really busy at the end of the semester, and finally they sent me the papers. I said, one of the criteria for getting this honors designation is not only you have to write the paper and I have to think it's good enough, but you have to come in and have like a half hour interview with me where I'm going to talk about, hey, let's talk about your paper. Let's talk about what you said. So one of the students finally got it to me on the very beginning of finals week. So after my deadline, but I was like so busy, I was like, no problem. We'll talk then. I'd forgotten about it, and they said, I want to come in tomorrow morning and talk about it. And I didn't open up. I opened up their paper 1/2 hour before they came in. I know, bad professor. I'm not prepared. I open up the paper, and I can't remember the title of the paper exactly, but it was something like Descent from Darwin. What did Darwin get wrong? I'm thinking, oh boy. All right, what's this going to be about? And I open it up, and I start reading through it. And what I did was I flipped right back to the references at the back, because I wanted to see, like, what are their sources. And the source was Casey Luskin, Jonathan Wells, and a variety of other things from the Discovery Institute, right? So, in fact, every single source was from the Discovery Institute. And I'm thinking, I only have 15 minutes to read this paper, and then I have to think about how I'm going to interact with the student. And so I read the paper, and it's pretty much just a litany of, here's things that are reasons why we should be skeptical of Darwinism in particular. It was like the transition fossils, and Cambrian explosion, and things that I'm familiar with. And so I'm wondering, how am I going to start this conversation? All right, what should I say? I had some idea, but what I wanted to know is, like, is this something they really they're really upset with me about the class and how I presented material, and they're presenting an alternative viewpoint. So anyway, the student comes in, sits down, and I just started out. I said, so what led you to, what was your interest in writing this particular paper? And they informed me that they love writing sort of pro con contrasting or contrary articles, trying to find an alternative viewpoint. They had heard me talk in class about natural selection, a variety of different evolutionary theory topics, right? And they found it all really interesting and all that, but they thought there must be another side of the story. And so what was fascinating about this, the reason I'm telling this story is, they had used Google, right, to look up, like, you know, other positions besides the standard evolutionary position. and they had run across the Discovery Institute, and also I'm trying to remember the website, but it's the one where they have the list of scientists who dissent from Darwin. I guess it's Darwin's Descent, right? .org or something like that. And they had obviously read a whole bunch of material on that page. They sculpted their entire paper out of that. It turns out this student had never heard of intelligent design or any of those concepts at all. So that wasn't their approach. That wasn't something they had thought. That wasn't something they were thinking. But when they went out, this is what they saw, and they thought that it sounded really compelling. They did. They were like, well, I don't remember hearing answers to this question. I don't remember hearing answers to this question or this. And this sounds really good. And what they said to me was, these seem like they're PhDs. They have degrees. They look. This looks like completely legitimate science, and they're publishing in journals and so forth. And so we ended up talking for 2 hours. We ended up having a 2-hour conversation that sort of delved into because they said, you know what, everything you said in class really kind of makes sense to me. But then it kind of came out later. Yeah, they were brought up in a Christian home. Um, they had really they had learned a little bit of young Earth creationism. If although they didn't even identify, they didn't even realize that's what they had learned, but they were sort of in that sort of realm. And they knew I had talked about that in class some. And then they started to say, well, but I kind of lost track of those types of things. But I've always just in the back of my mind wondered, like, how would I answer these questions? Like I've always grown up believing in God, but I've always been confused about these things. So now I've had this young Earth creation background, and now I've heard about these other things, and then now I'm reading the stuff I'd never heard before, and that sounds really good. How am I supposed to tell? And what I did was I didn't tell them, here's the truth or here's what you need to believe. It was a really fantastic opportunity to say, well, what are the real questions here? What are the fundamental questions that you really have? And the fundamental questions you really have are about who's in charge, right, of the universe. Who is the one that is the creator, much less how that person created. But um, and then we went through. We talked about the distinctions between. Okay, here I laid out, like, here's the fundamental assumptions of young Earth creationism. Here's what intelligent design is trying to do. They're saying, they're saying it's the world isn't just materialism. It isn't just the laws, right? There is something more there. Um, and then here are different Christian philosophies or theologies and how these different things fit in, and then presented to them, like, here's why different individuals that are Christians are seeking answers in these different ways, um, and then really encourage them to really think about um, how they can find you know how they can find God, and sort of recapture their interest in God by understanding that, not just saying, I want somebody else to tell me exactly what the truth is, but through this process of exploration, find God, and then work your way around to finding the best possible explanation, the best possible interpretation of these things. I don't want to just say, here's what you have to believe, because that's what your parents did to you, right? That's what your parents did for many, many years. They just told you, here's what you believe. And obviously you didn't follow their path exactly. I think you're muted, Sal.
If I may interrupt, I'm sorry to
Yeah.
cut you off, but
No,
just
no.
to help clarify a little bit for myself and the audience. So the conversation actually didn't begin with kind of like a metaphysical thing.
No, no, no.
And so did the conversation with the student, did he start divulging kind of his personal interests and his
Yeah.
metaphysical, and then so he started talking about his Christian faith here in a secular school to a professor at a secular school.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, really, that's what I can't. No, I shouldn't say I can't. I mean, it's a personal conversation, and we can go pretty much any way you want it to go. But I do feel like as soon as a student asks a question about, well, why do people believe this, right? That's all it takes for you to be
Right.
able to say, well, here's why somebody would say this. Here's why, you found these, maybe you found these intelligent design articles compelling because of X, right? Not just because you thought their science sounded good. Although what's fascinating about the intelligent, I forgot the bit of it in the story. The fascinating thing about this was not only did they find them on Google and just find their arguments interesting, they had no idea they were theistic. They had no idea that these intelligent design articles and the articles they read, because they didn't specifically mention God or they were shocked, all right, at first to find that out. When I said, well, what you did was you found, you found a group which has a specific, goal. They have an agenda, right? Just like we all have agendas, but here is their particular agenda. And here's what they're really trying to accomplish. And they're doing it in this way, right? They're trying to show that God, there has to be a God because of all these different reasons, right? That you can, I'll say, evidence yourself toward God, because I'm more of a presuppositionalist. But that's what they're doing, and that's what opens the door, right, to a student. And they're like, oh, okay, so then I've always wondered about that. Like, how would, is there really good evidence for God? I mean, once you get to that point, then you've opened up the conversation to wherever it can go.
I couldn't help but smile because I'm not I'm 5% presuppositionalist. I'm very much an
I'm more than 5%, but I'm not a complete,
so that, just in case you're wondering why I smiled, so I said that's another difference between.
Oh, I thought I could get a smile out of you. That's why I said
Oh
that.
yeah. So I just wanted to point out. So one reason Dr. Joel and I have some background, we have a shared background in Presbyterianism. I don't identify as a Presbyterian now. I'm just like I don't like, I tend to resist labels. But when I found out his some of his affiliations, because I saw it on some website, and I said, okay, he's a professing brother in Christ. There are some responsibilities that, because he's a brother and I'm professing brother, there are standards of conduct in how we're going to interact. And I said, okay, I'm going to honor that. So, let me just articulate my background. I was born into a Catholic home at age 16 or 17. At age 17, I became a Presbyterian, Reformed Presbyterian Church Evangelical Synod, which got absorbed into the Presbyterian Church of America. And I was a part of that for a long time, and then while I was in that, I joined Bible churches, including McLean Bible Church. And I used to identify as a 4-point Calvinist. I now identify as a Bibleist, meaning I prefer to resist labels. And I'll just say, okay, this is what the Bible teaches. And if it's a word like predestination or election in the Bible, I'll say, I believe it. I'm not going to try to systematize the theology too much and try to, and do I, and I'll just leave it at that. I don't feel like if there's something that's in the Bible and I'm a professing Christian, I need to apologize for it. So, if that's where I stand. But obviously, I still have very Presbyterian roots. If you'd like to share yours, I'd like to acknowledge here we have some people. We have someone who's in your fan club here. What your pastor didn't tell you, go Joel Duff, woot woot. And Brainbug is here. Cool Jesus is here. Logical, plausible, probable. So if you want to share some of your, because the viewers, yeah. I expect, okay, I'm sorry to ask personal questions, but they would be interested. If you feel at liberty to talk about that, please feel free.
Oh, definitely. So when you said you have some Presbyterian background, I can definitely say I had a lot of Presbyterian background. So my father is a Presbyterian pastor in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. He's retired now, but he's preached for 50 years. And he also was, I guess you'd call him, is one of the administrators of the denomination too for the last 15, 20 years of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. And my grandfather was one of the first pastors in the OPC back in the 1930s, along with Gresham Machen, if you've heard of Machen, who sort of brought uh, the Orthodox Presbyterian Church and other Presbyterian, eventually later on, other Presbyterian Church, the split peas, all the different split Presbyterian churches. Um, we He was one of the founding pastors of the OPC. And then my other grandfather, my father's father, was the first missionary of that particular denomination. And he was a missionary to Eritrea and Ethiopia. And my father was born in Ethiopia on the mission field. And so then eventually he came back, went to Westminster Theological Seminary, and then I was born in Chicago when he was helping to start a church as part of an internship during his last years at Westminster. And so from there, he took his first church in Colorado. And so I've been surrounded by that environment for a long time. I also have two uncles that are also pastors in that particular denomination too. So my whole life is traveling because you don't have much money when you're in that church. Yeah, so traveling and visiting other pastors' houses because that's what you do. You make the circuit on vacation and stay at other pastors' houses. And so through that, you know, I'm kind of known within that church because I'm the kid of a prominent pastor in that church. Now, what my father did and what my grandparents did doesn't mean that I, that doesn't automatically make me some sort of holy Christian or great Christian, right? I have to own that belief for myself. And I, and I do. Um, that said, I'm not exactly like my parents. And I think a lot of what you said, I know all the Reformed doctrines and Westminster Confession of Faith, and I've done Sunday schools, and I've taught through the Westminster Confession of Faith, and I've done all those different things. And I've been part of the PCA, the Presbyterian Church in America. So for those out there that don't know all the P's, the Presbyterian churches, the Presbyterian Church USA is sort of your broad, large denomination that's I'll call them super liberal church that has its historical roots all the way back to the Reformation, but has sort of lost its way over time. The OPC, the PCA, and some of the other Presbyterian churches, they're split offs that are essentially trying to recapture more of that historical Reformed faith. And so I very much ascribe to that historical Reformed faith, and I would call myself a 5-point Calvinism. But like you, I kind of, over the years have begun to sort of not like those kind of labels, right? You're right. The word predestination or election or so forth, because it does just put you in a box. Because Presbyterians have a certain reputation for being overly systematic, right? You use the word systematic, right? And I do systematic theology, and I'm really I've read a ton of systematic theology commentaries and so forth. So all of that informs my past, and then it's interesting to see over the years sort of how you shape that into your own faith as you branch out. Because one thing, if you're kind of insulated, and this is the same thing is true for those who are in Young Earth Creationism, if you're insulated and if you don't experience anything else, just like at the very beginning, you said, if you just went to a creation science college and you learned creation science, and then you try to do graduate work in that way, you may miss a lot of challenges that have been given to you that really are challenges for you to express God's world better, because you aren't challenged to really think deeply about what do you really believe. And for me, I went to Calvin College, which is a Calvinistic college, more so in the past than it is in the present. And I came out of there not really being challenged on this evolution and so forth. We just didn't really talk about it very much. And I don't really remember having deep conversations about Genesis and the issues that I talk about now. It wasn't until I went to graduate school at the University of Tennessee, and then I go to University of Tennessee. I go to a Bible Presbyterian church there, which is also a Reformed denomination, and from there, I'm also at a secular institution, And that's where the challenges, that's where it began to sort of like, hey, you've got a, at school, people are wondering like what this church thing is, because it's very evident that I go to church because I don't work on Sunday. And I'm very conscious about making that clear to people that I don't do events and I don't engage in a lot of different things that others do that day. And so they're like, how can you be that, right? What is your Christian faith? But then at the same time, I'm at a Bible Presbyterian church where I run into a bunch of Young Earth Creationists, because they had a essentially Young Earth Creationist leaning pastor who was a fantastic preacher, great man of God, learned a huge amount from him, right? And I lived in that environment without being a Young Earth Creationist, and totally appreciate everybody that was there. And it really grew a lot in that particular environment. Nonetheless, I was handed, and like, hey, here's my Genesis flood right here, right? I was given a copy of the Genesis flood by a member of that church who knew I was at a secular institution at University of Tennessee in a science department. And they're like, this is what you need so that you won't get tempted, right, by the devil there. And that was the first time I ever cracked open the Genesis flood. That was the first time I had heard of it. That's the first time I opened it up and like actually read Morrison Whitcomb's book.
You were a professor at that point?
No, I was a graduate student.
Okay.
Oh, I should have said at University of Tennessee, I did my master's degree and I did my PhD there. So 6 years, 2 years and 4 years.
What was your what was your program? You were biology and some specialization. What was your specialization?
I was in the Department of Botany, so they had a specific botany department there, and within botany, I went there not having any idea what I wanted to do. I just knew when I went to Calvin that, I started out as a physics major. I wanted to be an atom smasher. I wanted to be a physicist, or I wanted to be an astronomer. I was either go big or like go tiny, right? Those are my things. But I quickly learned that I can't do math. And so, just like, forget physics. Leave that to Sal.
Oh.
So I had to switch to something, and chemistry seemed like it had some math in it too, and I could get away with not being as math proficient. My Southern California public education in math didn't get me where I needed to be. so I decided to go into biology. But when I left there, it's like, what do you do with a biology degree, a basic biology degree, if you're not going to be a doctor? And I knew I didn't want to be a doctor. I never, ever entertained that idea, a doctor like medical doctor, right? And I just was like, well, I got to do something. I'm not really qualified to do anything with this bachelor's degree, at least anything I understood at the time. And I had a very kindly professor at Calvin that really directed me and took me under his wing, because I was super introverted, never talked to any faculty members there, and told me that I should go to graduate school. And he helped me basically through the application process. I never would have survived without somebody like saying, here's what you need to do, and I'll write you a letter, and really like push me along. And so then I went to University of Tennessee. I got the ability to a teaching assistantship there, which paid me, so I was able to survive there. And that's how I ended up at Tennessee. But okay, so you asked me what my actual areas. When I got there, I didn't know what I was going to do, and I ended up doing a small project for one professor, but didn't really care for what we were doing, and I switched to another one. And eventually we went out, another professor had a new apparatus, electrophoresis. He was doing allozyme electrophoresis. That's where you separate proteins through a charge, through a gel. And by doing so, you can look at the genetic differences between different species or different individuals, because the proteins, right, have different charge. You know about this stuff, Al, right? Sal, charges and shapes and so forth, right? And this is before you could sequence DNA. I'm old, right? So this was hot technology at the time. I was doing like really cutting edge stuff. So this, in fact, we had just gotten this new apparatus. He's like, we need to do something with it, right? So Joel, hey, I got this idea. We're going to go out and we're going to find these trilliums, which is a type of flower that grows in the Appalachians, and we're gonna compare a couple species and figure out their population genetics using this technology. So we went out, we didn't find any trilliums, and we found this plant called Isoetes. And it's a well, how should I explain what Isoedes is? It's a fern-like thing that almost nobody has ever seen or knows about. Quite rare. And we found one of those as we're walking along. And this professor who ended up being my master's thesis professor, he looks at that and he goes, "Hey, this is a pretty interesting plant too. Why don't we collect this and see what we can do with it?" 6 years later, I'd done a master's and a PhD on that particular plant. So I mean, it's just that's sometimes how things work. You don't
Yeah.
know where things are going to take you. And I found it really interesting. You start to develop the technology, and eventually, for my PhD, I did DNA because I went to Duke for like 2 weeks. I learned how to sequence DNA on these giant gels and pour these huge gels, and I sequenced, I think, 4 genes, and I sequenced 1,000 base pairs for each one, and that's took me a year to do, and that was one chapter of my dissertation.
Wow.
Now I can get an undergraduate to do that in a couple afternoons.
Yeah, because the technologies move forward. I just wanted to interject. Um, People wonder, it's like, Sal, why are you so friendly to people like Erica or Dr. Dan or Dr. Joel here? I view ourselves, you, me, Dr. Joel, Erica, we're fellow victims of graduate school. All right. I mean, honestly, people that have been through it, and depending on how grueling the program is, there's kind of sympathy for it. It transcends what your worldviews are. There is kind of a common bond of like,
Yeah,
hey, we've been under the gun together, we've suffered through this together, and um, you just respect the other person because you have peers like this. When I was in grad school, there are people that were obviously not Christians, certainly not creationists. We were all in this together. There's no reason to, we have to support each other. There's no reason to be just picking fights. Um, I mean, we disagreed, but uh, there's a feeling. It's like, we're trying to get through the system, and we understand. And anyone who's, I'm finding that fellow grad students, just not consistently, but I'd say for the most part, when they come on my channel and I know who they are, I don't see them on the internet picking random fights. The ones that actually have an education and have suffered through like the process you're describing, they're not out for blood. They're a lot more calm in academic and scholarly discussions and say, we can talk about this. There's no reason to make war over this. So
I think we're intensely in order to experience that, in order to go through all of that, all those years of really spending that much time, you have to be intensely curious. You have to just be interested in learning new things and learning and seeing where that goes. And so every day you're just kind of you're finding out what hits you next. If you come in with a particular agenda, like this is what I'm specifically want to get out of this, and I don't really care about what I'm being taught and so forth, it's really hard to go through all that. It really is, because you have to enjoy the process to some extent in order to really survive it. Now, that would be my recommendation to you. You have to find something you want to do
right.
and really enjoy that, and find fulfillment in what you're learning in order to sort of survive the grueling effort of the hoops you have to go through, and the people. I mean, because there are stumbling blocks along the way. There are people that are difficult to deal with, and hey, scientists have quirky personalities sometimes too, which don't, it's not always easy.
No, there's some that are just the most even-tempered people, and just really reasonable. But then you do get the quirky kinds, and but I see a wider spectrum in academia, and um, so you're talking about loving something. For a lot of my studies, I actually didn't love it, but I had to feel like it was for some higher purpose. And certainly
Well,
working,
that would be the other way. I mean,
yeah.
yes, if you have a higher goal and you have something you're trying to attain, you can push through for that goal.
So the question was, what yaks would you like Dr. Joel to engage with? Well, he's engaging with one right here. I wanted to say, well, I got to tell you, population genetics just was so distasteful for me to study, but because of my math background, it was like, yeah, that was a good fit for my skill set, but not my entertainment set. And you know,
that, that wasn't either for me, math or entertainment.
but yeah, but that produced probably so far my best publication ever, because I got to work with mathematicians and population geneticists, and I felt that the paper I produced, people will disagree, but it's like, okay, most of that was built on peer-reviewed literature that I had researched. I tried to quote the authors as fairly as I could in the space that we were allotted, and and it was ultimately something that I felt I had a higher purpose just to get at the truth. And yeah, I certainly had my biases, but I was glad to have dug in and said, okay, there is another side, and it's not told by the creationists, it's by the evolutionary biologists and the population geneticists themselves. And I said, this is cool enough. That being said,
this is how science works, right? Everyone does have their biases. I mean, we have perceptions and things we feel like we want to get out of the data. But so if we didn't have others that weren't pushing and pulling and producing other ideas and at least testing and challenging others, there isn't any way to move forward and pass those biases. I mean, I see that as one of the advantages of a scientific method is to help you get past your own biases. You can acknowledge you have those biases, and hopefully others can challenge you with evidence that can push you over that. It doesn't always happen. We know people that maintain their biases through their whole life and are never able to actually analyze their own biases. But it does, at least there's a chance.
I'm sorry to say this, but preachers fit into that. Sorry, I've had.
Yes, I know. Yes,
I've been very traumatized by preachers, and yeah, so that's a little bit about me. It's not been a pleasant journey, and especially now, my present church, where the preacher had and his team had threatened me with arrest and jail. Now he's facing a jury trial. It's just ugly there.
Yeah, I've watched a lot of your material there. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
That's a very challenging, and I understand, very upsetting situation to be in.
Oh yeah, if I weren't better grounded in the Christian faith, I would have thought all this was a charade. And so thankfully this happened later in my life after I recovered from my bouts of agnosticism. I did want to say, I want just to finish the thought about population genetics. I said, okay, I published in it. I'm done. I don't ever really want to go back. I want to do the math. I miss the physics math. I really do. And I'm hoping to do more of that. So Ben Kissling here says, anyone but the baraminologist surrounding Kurt Wise. And Ben Kissling cites Tim Clary, Jeff Tompkins, Jason Lyle, Nathaniel Jeanson, Rob Carter. Okay, I'll give you my biases here. I would write off Jason Lyle, not as a person, but his stuff on asynchronous convention, asynchrony, ASC.
Yeah, I never know how to pronounce that either.
I am working with Philip Dennis, who is probably a far more. I'm sorry to just have to be harsh here. He's a far more senior physicist who's a young Earth creationist. He's also published in the Secular World. He's a member of the American Physical Society. He's published in the prestigious American Physical Society physical review letters. And on this channel, I've been highly critical of Jason Lyle's work. And I'm sorry to, this is where it's hard, because if I criticize another young Earth creationist, it's like Salvador's bad, there has to be unity. I'm just like, I think there has to be truth first, and you speak your conscience. If you I could be wrong, but it will bother me if I didn't step forward and say, I have an objection. My conscience tells me this probably isn't right. I could be wrong, but if I remain silent, it's on me that I've remained silent. And if I'm a physics student who's concerned about what Jason Lyle has said about unmeasurability of one-way speed of light. And there are other physics students who are matriculating through school. And let's say they're young Earth creationists and they're raised on this. They start to study special and general relativity and say, hey, I don't think that's right. And you get the feeling that you've been lied to. And so even when I tried to put some cautions in the stuff that I say, I said, this is the best that I could deliver. If you find something wrong, go with what you find is right. So let me give
I can't say anything about Lyle because I can't do the physics.
And
so I do know my limits in some cases.
Okay, so for biology, a young Earth creationist that I would recommend: 3, Rob Stadler, Change Tan, Joe DeWeese. Joe DeWeese and I have been co-authors. He publishes on Topai Samres. So you might classify him more as an ID guy because he doesn't publish in Young Earth Creationism. Paul Nelson.
Yeah, sure.
Paul Nelson, very respected. He's published in Secular World. John Sanford, my colleague and former boss, my present colleague, former boss, John Sanford, secular professor, Cornell University. So some other names: John Gideon Hartnett, tenured professor, associate professor in Australia, 200 peer-reviewed papers, many PhD students, works on oscillator-controlled clocks, sapphire-controlled clocks. So they're, unfortunately, the people that get all the press are not necessarily the best scientists. Rob Carter's fine, good guy. Tim Clary, also secular professor. Nathaniel Jeanson and Jeff Tompkins. Okay, so I think very highly of Nathaniel Jeanson, but I begged him to say, start. And he promised me, I said, Nathaniel, they're graduate students on my channel. You need to start addressing graduate level questions. If you to reach people that are on, kind of the audience I reach out to. And he said, yeah, I really work toward the popular press. Jeff Tompkins he's a good guy. He's had to make some retractions on some of his stuff on chimp-human similarity. So I've given you the names off the top of my head who are young Earth creationists that I think are excellent, but they don't get a lot of the press. And a lot of the stuff that they work on is not specifically young Earth creationism. It's intelligent design. For me personally, I really have a heart for Walter Brown. I just love the guy. Okay, and Brian Nichols. So Walter Brown's an outcast in the young Earth community.
Yeah, sure.
But I love him to death. So, but Ben, thank you for sharing.
How much following do you think Walter Brown has these days? Because I just talked about him on one of my This Week Creationism.
Very small.
I'd say I used to hear about him all the time, and I have his book, and I used to interact with that, but I rarely hear. It's like an older generation knows him, or I'll hear them refer to him, but I don't hear in the new generation.
Yeah, he's getting old. I'd say 10% of the Young Earth Creationists I encounter on YouTube are Walter Brown fans, and I'm a big Walter Brown fan because I really liked his engineering sense, and he did come from a very good school. Got his PhD from MIT in mechanical engineering in 2 years. You got to have some. You have to have some ability to be able to do that. Honorable guy, just the sweetest guy. And he introduced me to some physics stuff, which I'm always interested in. So one reason that he's suppressed is other young Earth creationists don't like him. So, to give the relative size of the organizations, AIG's annual budget revenues $60 billion.
Yeah.
Institute of Creation Research, $10 million.
Yep.
And Creation Ministries International in the United States is $3 million. So when they talk about the big three, it's like, well, there's just like one really gigantic one, which is Answers in Genesis. And then, but Institute of Creation Research has a great history. So, and then Walter Brown is like none of those, So you have these smaller ones. smaller creationists, organization, personalities or organizations. But
Yeah.
so thank you for asking. So now I had a chance to talk. Just share your heart here.
Yeah, no, this I really great to hear you talk about that and talk about sort of the different arenas of creationism, because I don't know if you may not have seen it, but I have multiple blog posts and I did a couple videos on what I call the new creationist. That's just sort of my lingo for sort of my way of dividing young earth creationists into two main camps. But what you've just done for me is I think you've given me sort of a three layered approach to this, and I'll explain why. So for me, I consider you a new creationist, right? And to me, a new creationist are the ones that are not in the major apologetics ministries, who do have sort of a public-facing general approach, and are led by charismatic leaders for the most part. But there's this other ring of creationists I see outside of that are in academia, right? They're like professors at Liberty or at Cedarville or at other places. They understand academics, and so they're publishing in Creation Science Research Quarterly or an Answers Research Journal or something like that. And they're more able, I think, to talk to each other and converse on sort of this academic level, which also isn't nearly as polemic. And they don't use the same language of just extremes where it's like, this is the way it is. I mean, if you listen to ICR, sometimes it's like they act as if this is the flood boundary rather than this is a hypothesis for where the flood boundary could be. And we should engage in a discussion about that. And so I see that there's this ring of, and Todd Wood and New Creation Blog and others that are engaging in creationism in a way. Oh, and one of the big differences I see as well is they're willing to talk to people like myself. They're willing to hear what others are saying and maybe engage with some of those arguments and help refine their arguments and maybe actually admit where something could be better and change their minds. Whereas for me, most of the traditional young earth creationists that are at organizations where you know what happens with organizations, right? You see it even in ministries, right? Once you have a leader, once you have an organization and they kind of have a identity, it's hard for them to ever move out of that identity. It's hard for them to ever have a paradigm shift because everything is sculpted around that identity and they've already sort of proclaimed the truth of different things. And mind you, I believe that all young earth creationists do share the basic essentials of young earth creationism in terms of their assumptions about the interpretation of the scripture, the authority of the word of God, and all these things. But in terms of their operation or the way they go about in their ministry and their apologetic and how they go about communicating to the non-believer and the believer, I find there's these different approaches. That's why I call them the new creationists. I think it's sort of the newer, not always newer, because I think Kurt Wise and others are also have that approach. But what you've done for me right now is you've given me, you're right, I have not really kind of taken that next slice of creationists that are on that fringe of young earth creationists, or maybe not completely young earth creationists, but maybe have leanings or sympathies, but are more interested in the intelligent design sort of apologetic or that method of changing the world, right? Of that area of sphere of influence.
Well,
And maybe I really do need to pay some more attention to that sort of group.
well, there are inner conflicts. So,
Sure. Yes.
and I, people said, why don't you work for AIG or ICR? I said, I wanted my independence to think.
And yes, and that's what I appreciate about.
I was
Yes.
extremely, if I went into secular academia and I'm like doing electrical engineering, it's like, okay, I'm not worried about that. I mean, your devices either work or they don't. I mean, there's not doctrine. I mean, if you're making electrical engineering theories about how devices work and what they're going to do, etc., there's a final arbiter, and it's not peer review committees or politics. It's whether what you built and you predict, whether it actually comes to pass. And I kind of like that environment. That's my mindset. Whereas what I've been seeing in some of these creationist organizations, it's like, I think there's a lot more doctrine than there are observations and data points. And I do want to address something here. Ben Kissling says Hartnett agrees with Lyle. I would agree with Lyle in a what they call a Milne universe. If you just had nothing and maybe just a photon here or there, you could not independently establish a you would not be able to measure a one-way speed of light depending on the conditions. But if you have things like cesium beam atomic clocks, etc., and you have matter, it becomes really easy. And I showed a photograph of that where we had femtosecond photographs. You could measure it, and there's also pictures of these like nebular gases, and you get a light pulse, a burst, and you could see the light traveling. You could actually see the speed of light in two directions. And I'm working with Dr. Philip Dennis. So Hartnett would agree with Lyle only in, I would say, to the extent that even I would, which is when you don't, in a universe where you're limited in your measurement apparatus. But if you're given certain measurement apparatus, like that femtosecond thing, femtosecond photographs, or some of these things in that, like some of our telescopes are handling, we could see that. And I'm sorry to rag on him, but that's a little bit closer to my wheelhouse and something I'm working on. Of course, I could be wrong, and this is a discussion to be had. But what's my point? What if I joined ICR when Jason Lyle was president? I'd be toast. I'd say, boss, why don't you go to Philip Dennis here, and I think you need to learn from him. I'd probably get fired. Okay, that's why it's difficult to join these, and I think Dr. Dennis would be fine with me sharing this. I said, Phil, the way we need to do kind of this discussion is we don't want to be activistic, meaning, we got to put something out there and persuade people of Young Earth Creationism. What we want to do is get at the truth. And I had suggested we have an open peer review where someone publishes something, we invite qualified critics to say, hey, I disagree or I agree with this. And you just record it, because that's been a little bit of a trend even in the secular world, where I've seen that some of these papers, qualified expert, and then he invites 3 viewpoints of people he respects, and they'll say yay or nay. And I'm like, I'm cool with that. Why don't we do it that way? Because I'm going to say stuff that you don't agree with, and I'm not asking you to put a rubber stamp. I would rather have your objections published, and if we can't come to a resolution, rather than kill the paper, let's just move it forward, and if I change my mind, we'll issue revisions. That doesn't happen very much in Young Earth Creationism. So there are all these models. There are like 14 models of cosmology and solving the distant starlight problem. As a matter of principle, at least 13 of those have to be wrong. Okay, so I'm just saying, if I join an organization and they're advocating one particular cosmology, I could be toast. And I said, I want the freedom to dissent, and that's not the culture among these big, evangelistic organizations. They want to have a message that they think is persuasive, and they're not therefore organized to make lots of retractions, and therefore it's more advocacy than actual research, and that's problematic.
Yeah, they're not really interested in discovery. You're right. They're interested in taking the information that's been discovered by others, maybe others outside of their realm, and then just incorporating it into their particular way of promoting that material. And I see Ben Kissling keeps asking about, having real research. You can't really compete if you don't have research dollars. And sure, I understand that, money can be a limitation, but I will say Answers in Genesis, as you said, has a very large budget.
$60 million.
They dedicated an extremely small amount of that to research. I could come up with dozens of projects that wouldn't be that costly that I think would be very helpful and informative for testing their own models and ideas and improving upon them. I don't think they're interested in testing. I think they are a, I mean, it specifically answers Jess. They're really an apologetics ministry, not a scientific. That's not their starting point. Now, ICR, I will give ICR some credit. They've really stepped back, and Guliuza has just recently reaffirmed that they are going to really stress, doing, research and being a research first place. But of course, they have a very strong hand there that's saying, here's the two things we're going to research, and we have a particular viewpoint that we're really pushing. And so that would be another difficult situation to be in if you disagreed with that particular viewpoint.
Yeah, and I had lunch with Randy, and I conveyed my reservations about some of the ideas, and that was kind of hard to do because he was so gracious to feed me lunch when I was down at the ICR. I didn't want to just insult my host, but that's the way science goes, and yeah, we have to get to the point where we can take each other out to lunch and say, I totally disagree with everything you said. I walked into his office. He said, I totally disagree with your boss's views, which was Dr. Sanford's. I'm like, okay, I think he's a straight shooter, and I appreciate that. And then he takes me out to lunch. So it's like, I disagree with your boss's views, but let me take you out to lunch. I respected him from that. There's a comment here. Cool Jesus says, evidence and reasons. I'll hang around for the whole debate if I can ask a question. Are you KPG or Paleocene, Pleistocene flood boundary guy?
He's trying to pigeonhole you. He's trying to pigeonhole you. Don't let him do that.
This isn't a debate. This is,
yes.
If you looked at the title, it was Meeting Under Truce, which means we're not going to fight. And I tried to put in the video description, we're going to try to find some common ground to help the viewers. So this channel is not.
Oh, is he asking me? I thought he was asking you.
I don't know. But I think he is asking me, but I'm just pointing out this is not a debate tonight. I also don't like debates that are short format. I'll debate someone if he wants to mix with me for
3+ hours
straight, 12 hours straight. We'll do it under strict rules of engagement. And because there's something called Brandolini's law where your opponent can just make BS and you're just destroyed, and just like, I know that's not true, but I don't have time to go demonstrate to the audience all the references that'll point out you just made that up. And sometimes they will make stuff up and you're Googling around and you find out there's no hits on this. He just made that up. And I wasted all my time, and he got away with it. That's why I don't like some of these live debates, because there's stuff like that. They can also, sometimes if it's not well moderated, the other guy can interrupt you right when you're making a great point. Matt Dillahunty was really nasty at that. That was pretty sketchy when I was debating him. So to the question, potassium and PG, I don't know. PG.
He's talking about the Cretaceous Paleogene boundary versus the Paleocene Pleistocene boundary, and that's the debate between Answers in Genesis and ICR in terms of where the post-flood boundary is, right? Because they differ greatly in terms of where they fall out.
I'll tell you, first off, direct answer, I don't know, and at this point I don't care. Okay, I'm sorry to
good answer.
I don't know, and I don't care. And I think, for me, I'm focusing on explaining the problems with radiometric decay. And despite the fact that some creationists will say, oh, it's so unreliable, don't bother with that. I'm just like, no. For physics students, you don't do this dismissal, because a physics student will say it's unreliable in some cases. That doesn't mean you can generalize it to all cases. And I'm very concerned, and I can convey that because Andrew Snelling, I was at a meeting 10 years ago, and the whole crowd agreed at this creation biology meeting that we haven't resolved all the problems of radiometric dating. The Young Earth Creationists need to find an answer to some of these. So that's where I am. That's my focus. The next is distant starlight. And Dr. Joel, thank you for indulging me. The channel thrives on our viewers, so I apologize. I sometimes have to kind of interrupt the direction of the conversation.
It's your channel. You do what you want. You say what you want.
Well, I'm just trying to explain, to cater to the people that have supported this channel. So I'm going to look at the
I'm an
Like
interloper
that.
here.
And why don't you, if you have something on your heart while I look at this, go ahead.
Oh, I'll just piggyback on that and say that. So I work at a secular institution. I see students all the time who come to my class. Like I teach a non-majors biology class, and so we just cover a wide variety of topics. And they'll come after we're talking about just like a brief section on like evolutionary biology, and I have a very friendly way of introducing that topic, and I'm very upfront about this is just a topic you need to understand the basics of. You need to understand what natural selection is. Most of this is not controversial in the sense that we're talking about what are the things that are happening outside right now in terms of how organisms are adapting in their environment. But I'll have students who I have a Q&A time in my classes, and it's anonymous Q&A. So I have usually 1 or 2 days in a semester, and I give them an index card. They can bring it in. They can write whatever they want, any question that they want to ask. It can be a challenge. It can be something they read somewhere, something that some friend asked them. I've always wanted to know X. And then I have a student who picks them all up, and I never see the questions. I have another student who takes the questions, shuffles them in front of the class, and then they just pick a question out and they ask it, and I have to answer it, in front of 150 students. And it's very interesting because, and over the years, it's really challenging to me because, of course, I'm on my toes because I could get asked anything, anything about biology, but I usually do this after the evolution section, and that's where their interests are mostly sort of tweaked, right? And so, you get a wide variety of questions, but what I get questions that are very personal because I tell them they can ask me personal questions. If they're asking to me anonymously, they can ask, and they'll ask things about like, I was always taught this. What do you think of that? Or here's something I heard. Or they'll just directly say, radiometric dating doesn't work, so therefore this whole thing is a bunch of bunk. And so when you say that, I'd say what Young Earth Creationists need to do is teach those within their followers to be careful not to use such direct language without acknowledging that there are at least situations where radiometric dating works. Like you said, carbon-14 can be reliable in some circumstances. So even if you think it doesn't work in some, you shouldn't make these blanket statements. And the thing is, the student will believe that they've absolutely they've just crushed you, right? I just demolished your argument, and I don't even talk about radiometric dating in class because I think it's too complex for people to really get into. So I kind of avoid it myself. And yet they'll come in and they'll just be like, all right, checkmate, because radiometric dating is a bunch of BS. And so therefore you can't know the age of the earth. And like, that's not a very, come to my office, let's talk about that. It's just not your best approach in a classroom situation.
Absolutely. And I could cite all these creationists if I had the time and I really, the inclination, and I don't. 20 years ago, they were just ragging on carbon-14 dating. After this whole stuff with the Cole and Mary Schweitzer, suddenly carbon-14 dating is like the most reliable thing. I'm just like, yeah. Do you see that this does not reflect well collectively on the Young Earth Creationist culture to be kind of doing these Kent Hovind-ish kind of approaches?
Yeah.
It's not going to win the culture that if you're trying to get people trained and then become leaders in secular society. I'm not saying that we Young Earth Creationists overtake, but they're so underrepresented, and it's sad. And I do want to address something here. Ben Kissling is raising something about a decent NIH grant. A single grant nowadays is 10 million, 1/3 of AIG's budget. Okay, so this came up because as I was working for Dr. Sanford, and there's an internal discussion. It's like, okay, are creationists going to do research or not? And because we keep being accused of not doing research. And just internally, and also just between me and him, and I think we could just share this. I said, Dr. Sanford, we don't have the money. What we do have is we have the NIH. Why don't we just grab whatever they're publishing that might be helpful to our cause? Because, like, for example, the ENCODE Roadmap Epigenomics projects, this is $1 billion of research. I think they're friendly. we could use what they have done to our benefit. And he said, Sal, yeah, let's go that route. We don't have the money to spend. We don't have $1 billion to spend for sure on research. But I said, see, John, they're doing a lot of stuff for medical research that's friendly to our cause on the topic of junk DNA. And and I said, you could just have me full time, just looking at all the papers and experiments, and let me just come back to you on what we got. And I've shared some of that on my channel. So to Ben Kisling's point, I thoroughly agree with you. Nowadays, it's 10 million or more, 1/3 of AIG's budget. I would say this. I mean, just speaking as a personal Christian, I think that God is ordaining the secular world to help the young Earth creationists, because the example with the ENCODE roadmap epigenomics, E4 epitranscriptomics, $1 billion worth. And like they couldn't have done a better job of helping me make the case that more of the genome is functional in a certain way. And there's no way we could have spent that. I'm excited about this stuff with low energy nuclear reactions. NASA's pursuing it on our behalf. They may be solving part of the young Earth problem with radiometric dating. So okay, I'm just preaching here. I believe the Lord is thinning our numbers down, so we can't boast that it was our genius or our ability. It had to be by providence. And I know Dr. Joel has probably a different view about young Earth creationism, but I'm just sharing that with you, Ben. I think this is like Gideon's battle, that we're not going to have access to the money, and that's by God's design. So that's just my feeling. Dr. Joel?
Well, if I sit here and smile and nod, it's going to make it seem like I agreed with everything you said. And I would disagree about some of your interpretation of the evidence, but I will say that I do think that there's a lot of data out there that everybody can access. It's becoming more accessible to everybody. And if you have the knowledge to be able to interpret evidence, there's a tremendous amount of evidence being extracted from the world that I think is we have to talk about as reliable evidence. It's observations that I think we can all agree are facts. And those facts then can be interpreted in different interpretive frameworks and applied to other research questions. Like somebody never thought to analyze this data in this way. And that's why you don't need $10 million. I mean, we have graduate students here doing PhDs on $5,000 budgets and doing amazing work. Now, that doesn't mean 5,000 would be the total, because they're also teaching assistants. And so there is $20,000 a year for them to do that. So, so 100,000 in terms of the commitment of the university, but of course, they're getting payback from cheap teaching that way too. Large sums of money aren't really necessary, which is why I kind of cringe, or I reject this idea that Answers in Genesis can't really afford to do research. No, it doesn't take. Be creative. With really good computers, you can do a heck of a lot of molecular biology research.
Well,
you just need to know how to do it.
Now, I do want to say, I'm not going to. Yeah,
that's where you're going to need to go to a public institution probably to get that know-how in order to be able to really be able to use that data properly.
So I'm not going to weigh into this where Ben is going about. He says the point is that Joel and many others are claiming we don't do science while denying us the means to do it. I'm not going to weigh in that, but I'm gonna if you'll indulge me a little bit, I'm just going to point out something that I found personally valuable. When this may seem strange, people wondered, it's like, Sal, don't you read creationist literature? It's like, no, I don't trust it. I'm sorry. Because they want to persuade you about their viewpoint. And that's great, because I'm a creationist too. But what makes me believe in young Earth creationism is when I read secular literature and I read that passage that says, oh, wow, he has the most impartial, he has a bias toward the opposite view that I have. And so when I saw the ENCODE consortium say that, okay, they officially said 80%, And I said, maybe they kind of overplayed their hand. But when I'm around the researchers themselves and I get their sentiment that it's functional, I'm like, I can't run away from that. And they don't have an agenda like a creationist saying God did it. Some of them may be theists, but when they, as medical researchers, and I ask them because they're my professors, and I say, "What does this do?" And they said, "I don't know, but it's there for a reason." That's the sentiment there, and that for that reason, I know it may look kind of grim that young Earth creationists don't get paid for their research, but you know what? I don't know that I'd necessarily trust it if it came from a young Earth creationist camp. That's why if I had my experiments done, I'd probably want a secular guy to do it for me. And I would send it off to labs that are secular, And it means more to me that, for example, Mary Schweitzer, not a young Earth creationist, it is more valuable to me that she reported what she found as far as dinosaur tissues. So, Dr. Joel, that comment was directed to you. In fairness, I feel free to respond, and then we'll just move to another topic because I don't want to get this. I don't want you getting into a fight.
I don't want to argue about encode.
Yeah.
But point well taken about. But I will add that. How should I put this? I've had this dream idea for a long time, or this suggestion that I've made several times as well, that for some of these thorny questions where you have Christians who say that you don't understand this data, you're misinterpreting it, and it's a question of the interpretation of the data and the reliability of the data itself. And then young Earth creationists have another interpretation. They say you don't understand this data. I've had this idea: why can't a couple young Earth creationists and non-young Earth creationists, but Christians, who we agree are going to be faithful to desiring to understand the truth, come together and do a research project together in which they both write sort of like your two sides. We both collected the data, we both saw the data, and these are our interpretations. And I can think of a couple of examples of where that could happen. But I just don't think it would really happen because mostly that would be with Young Earth Creationist apologetics ministries, and I just don't believe they're really interested in pursuing, even acknowledging that there is a question, right? They just want to say, here's the way it is.
Well,
but maybe there is an opportunity to do those types of things with others.
Okay, so this is where I have sour grapes. Okay, so I was before I entered graduate school, I was being vilified by people at AIG. Not direct; they weren't calling me by name, but they said if you don't accept Young Earth, I was an old Earth creationist. They're calling me all sorts of names, and I'm like, okay, I have these questions. Why don't you answer them? Of course, they never answered it. All it was just vilifying me and attacking my character. And so that left sour grapes. And I said, what you're doing is building amusement parks rather than even at least acknowledging that I have legitimate scientific questions. Because if they weren't legitimate, you would have been able to answer this in scientific terms. Instead, I'm being browbeaten by doctrine. So
you don't have enough faith, Sal.
Yeah. So this is a real sore point for me personally. I said I think, on scientific grounds, I think I've advanced young Earth creationism more than certain popularizers. And
I view a number of other people that are in sort of this academic circle as the ones, and I've written in this, I'll have to send you the article I've written, because I've said the future of Young Earth creationism is not in the Young Earth apologetic ministries, because there's no future there, because they're not, I'm not saying they need to have a massive paradigm shift and change their basic assumptions about the Bible and so forth, but they have to be willing to critique themselves in some way and learn how to learn from others.
Yeah.
And so those that are outside of that group, eventually they're the only ones coming up with new ideas. new approaches to old
Exactly.
problems. They're stuck with the same solution, which doesn't work, even by
Doesn't
other
work.
young earth creationists. Other creationists can see it doesn't work,
Okay.
but they've so committed to it that they can't even question those things that other creationists clearly identify as things that are
Yeah.
problematic answers. And this is why they eventually are doomed to eventually break apart or fail as an organization. I don't know how long that'll take, but it's
Well,
inevitable, because eventually another group of solutions will arise that will hopefully be better solutions and will attract an audience. That's a long-term outlook. But I think that's what other creationists have in mind. That's what Todd Wood and others would think, is like, we're hopefully generating better answers that eventually will win the day.
well, I will say this. Answers in Genesis is an entertainment enterprise.
Yeah.
Okay? It's so it won't live or die on the science. It's
Oh, you're right. They've moved away from the science. Yeah.
okay.
It'll live and die
I don't want
on
to
the
just
cult,
make a broad
on where
brush.
they end in the culture wars.
Okay,
Yes.
they're not solely a scientific. They're not solely an entertainment industry, but they're mostly $100 million amusement park is, if that's a large part of your budget, what you're into is making amusement parks. It's not scientific research.
They're
And
educational amusement parks, though.
yeah, so, educational. So, um, you know, uh, I'll give you a tangible example because I was at ICC 2018 and also 2013. Steve Austin described a flume experiment. He was trying to get funds for it. He said be under $1 million, could even be $250,000. Couldn't get funding for it. He said we could be the premier group that will study the effects of turbulent flow in sediments and creating layers. Because there was an experiment at the Colorado School of Mines, and he couldn't get any money for this. He spoke twice, same topic. And I'm like, okay, yeah. For myself, I spent money out of my own pocket to build an interferometer to try to actually measure preferred speed of light through the ether. I got inconclusive results. So, you know, like a lot of organizations with money, it's whoever is able to grab the pie will get the priority, whether their stuff is any good or not. And that's just the way it's going to be. So, you know, um, I could say that AIG has funded some very fine researchers. I think very highly in Nathaniel Jeanson. But as far as buying laboratories uh, and and like constructing Stephen Austin's dream of a geological laboratory, it's not happened, and I'm sad it hasn't happened at Cedarville, because Cedarville is a great geological. It's probably one of the few young Earth geological organizations, and it's actually run by pretty good professors. I've heard.
Yeah, they take their
Evolu-
students to, or they take students to geological meetings.
Yeah, I've heard evolutionists say they would love to study under John Whitmore. They respect him as a young Earth creationist geologist because his geology knowledge is so good. And
I know students that have gone to that program. So I know individuals who have gone to that program, and really they know a lot of geology, and they have jobs in geological fields.
So anyway, we can move on to another topic. If you'd like to share, we're at the 1 hour 24 mark, 1 hour 24 minutes. If you want to continue, we can.
We're just getting warmed up.
Yeah, yeah. We could talk. We could have another show like this and to examine these things. So I will tell you that if I got a grant, I have some ideas of how I might spend the money. I think I would. Okay, let's say I did have $10 million that some generous donor wanted to give for young Earth creation research. I certainly wouldn't donate it. I certainly would not donate it to Dinosaur Adventureland. Someone donated a lot of land. I wouldn't do that. I would invest it in this flume that Stephen Austin really wants to build. That's where I would put the research. Um, some of the stuff with radiometric dating, I'm going to leave that to the secular world, because the stuff with low energy nuclear reactions, that's going to take an awful lot of money, and the risks are very high that you might not succeed, because many have tried and failed, but some have succeeded enough to at least impress me. So there is stuff happening at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory or in that vicinity, um, that could solve parts of the YEC problem, but they're oriented toward their agenda, which is low energy nuclear, which is nuclear fusion. And there are other groups doing that too. And so even with like hundreds of millions of dollars, I don't know that the Young Earth Creationists would necessarily come out with a result that's promising, because it's what they call high risk research. You're going to throw money at this, you don't know if it's going to work. It's going to give you the result
Yeah,
you're expecting. That's high risk research.
there
And
are so many other areas of research for which you don't have to devote that much resource to. And really, a massive amount of meta-analysis, essentially that's what ICR and some other researchers are doing, is a form of meta-analysis, right? They're taking data from lots of other projects, synthesizing that, and then seeing how they can interpret that data within their biblical framework. And if they can synthesize all that data from the real world and make a cogent argument that then explains the data as well or better, right, than the secular interpretation of that same data, well, that's a tremendous advancement for young Earth creationism. You don't
I
have
think
to do original research in the sense of I have to go out and actually collect the data or perform this particular experiment.
you did point out something very interesting. So you spent an entire year trying to get, um, you sequenced 4 genes. It took
Yeah.
you a year. Now that you said your graduate students can do that in an afternoon, what took you a year. And I wanted to point out some of the physics experiments that used to be very expensive. uh, Even on my little budget, I could almost build them. And I'm going to try again to build that interferometer. Um, some of the stuff we have now, God is just providing technology that's making it easier. And so the solution isn't necessarily we throw more money at this. Maybe we just wait on the Lord to provide us the
Well,
means. As far as the $10 million, with $500,000, we could probably redo some of the Michelson-Morley experiments with refractive media. And I think we're going to get some interesting results. And I tried to build an interferometer that wasn't as sophisticated as Michelson-Morley, but so I'm just throwing that out there. There are some things that are almost on the horizon that we could actually do, and I'm working with Philip Dennis to help me redo this interferometer. And also, there's some optical physicists that I'm hoping to recruit. It's still high risk in the sense it could fail, but it's not high risk in the sense it's going to be a budget breaker at this point. So
with with respect to molecular biology and genetics, we're in an age of just we're just it's obese. I don't know what the word is. We're just overloaded with data. I mean, sequencing genomes and then just throwing them up, and it's like maybe you sequence the whole genome just to study one gene. Well, that means there's this massive amount of other data that no one's even sifted through or played with or explored before. And so we're entering in the realm of times in which whatever question you have, there's probably a data set out there that you can go and collect. Now, I know it's different for some fields, right? But there are fields of study that have very interesting questions with respect to origins for which I think there's an enormous amount of data that can synthesize. I mean, look what Nathaniel Jensen's just done, right, with his book, Traced. He didn't collect any data. He didn't actually sequence any Y chromosome genome chromosomes. He didn't. All he did was, in fact, he didn't even really synthesize the actual data. He simply looked at other people's data and did meta-analysis by comparing lots of collections of data, and then reinterpreted that data, right, within this biblical framework of 4,500 years for common ancestry of the Y chromosome. And so had he now, so I'm going to say he was not very successful in providing a compelling argument for how all that data could be understood within that framework. But nonetheless, disagree about that. If he did produce a very compelling argument that this is a better way to understand this data compared to the typical approach to understanding that data, then you are pushing the field forward, right? And you are then actually bending, you are forcing individuals to say, oh, this data could be interpreted better this way in this biblical framework. I don't expect, as a non-evidentialist, I don't necessarily expect people who's like, oh, you're right, the data points to that, so I'm going to therefore believe the Bible. However, I would say overall, the goal should be to best, we should all be seeking the truth from God's world, right? In whatever gifts we've been given, in order to bring glory to God, right? We're all trying to glorify God by shining a light on what he has done and saying, magnifying him, not for our own interest, not for our own benefit, but to bring greater glory to God. And yeah, I don't know where I'm going with this after that, but just
Yeah.
because I think that's a really important point, I just have to stick that in there.
Well, I mean, I'm for Young Earth Creationists getting money, but as I said, there are some aspects where the research risk is really high. You could throw $1 billion at it, and you might draw a blank. And so
Yeah,
this is like what I'm just saying. This is my feeling. We have to wait on the Lord because just like with the gene sequencing thing, would cost $3 billion before it can now be done with thousands. You see,
yeah.
if we had if we tried to throw 3 billion at something and then we just wait 20 years, now we can do it for 3,000. It's like, don't you see then that maybe you just wait a little bit and it starts to become accessible? Because there was a paper Dr. Sanford and I released as a preprint. We were fighting this thing about nylon eating bacteria for 35 years. And finally, 2017, we came out with a result. We've been rejected 7 times, but all the editors and reviewers said, you're right, but this is like, we're not going to publish it for whatever reason. That we demonstrated that the nylon eating, quote unquote, eating enzyme had actually, it has homologs that are ancient all over bacteria, but we wouldn't have known that when Ono published this paper. But because of all the gene
Yeah.
sequencing,
Oh, yeah.
I went to my professor at the NIH. He said, Sal, you're absolutely right. This Ono was wrong. Said that. And so we didn't have to spend $1 bazillion doing the gene sequencing. We just had to wait a couple decades until we have all these labs around the world sequencing bacteria, looking at their genes, and depositing it. All we had to do then is invest research money to pay me to go to the gen bank. And so, I feel your pain about wanting to throw money at yet research, but I got to tell you, I don't,
So,
it depends. Do you want laboratory research? That's going to be a lot of money and it's high risk. You may not find what you're looking for.
So let's throw a little thing in here. This afternoon or this morning, I met with a doctoral student. I'm on their committee, and we sat down to discuss their proposed project because they just proposed some projects for their dissertation. And the thing they want to do is they want to sequence the whole genome of a clam shrimp. It's a small crustacean. And so we sat down, and she had gotten some quotes. So we went through and we talked about the protocol for like what we're going to do. How to get the DNA, and then how we're going to get the sequence. So the quote we have is for $3,700. $3,700. If we send DNA to this place, they'll get us 120. I think it was 2.1 billion base pairs of sequence, and they'll catenate it together and figure out the chromosomes, and we'll have the 120 million base pair genome with like 15 times coverage within a couple weeks. So and she's going to be able to answer a whole bunch of interesting questions about repetitive DNA elements, so signs, lines, endogenous retroviruses, and so forth. Because what she's doing is she's actually looking across. We have another genome already, and we're looking at, do those genomes fall? Do those different elements align themselves more frequently in certain hotspots in the genome versus sort of randomly spread through the genome? And it has to do with her looking at the sex chromosomes and how one of the sex chromosomes is reduced in size. And there's a theory, right? There's a hypothesis out there about endogenous retroviruses causing the divergence of the sex chromosomes, so that you have more and more distinction between the male and the female sex chromosome. And so she's testing that hypothesis. Has one genome of a male, we need a genome with just female, so that we can compare the patterns of ERVs. She's going to do that whole project. I think $3,700 is way too much, and so I told her she has to go get 2 more quotes, because I think we can get it down to $1,000. But that's if she's willing to do the computer stuff and actually do the alignments herself and generate the genome.
That's just unimaginable that it's this.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, because
Yeah.
20, 30 years ago, if you got a quote like that, you're like, that's insane. But we can do it now. We can do it now. I will tell you, okay, so, as far as Sal getting funded, I'll tell you what's my sore spot. There's some probably very dishonest pastors, and their salaries and the amount of money. It's like, I'd be glad to see them get cut off and that money be sent to my work. At least I'll report if I'm, the experiment didn't work. So that's where my biases are. And I'm for just personally, as far as federal grants, I'm for the federal government just butting out and just of taking people's tax money and deciding for them how it's going to be spent. That's just my feeling. If people want to make space probes, I'll say, okay, why can't they just specify on their tax return, I want it to be spent on a space probe? That I think is the fairest thing.
Then we'll see what we really want.
Yeah, if you're really passionate about this or that project, it's like, okay, that's how I feel. I don't like the idea of the federal government and these corrupt politicians deciding for you how your money is spent. That's just, you can tell my libertarian leanings there. That's how I feel. So, I'm for people supporting my work if they want to. That's it.
A GoFundMe account. Saying.
Oh, okay. Ben.
No.
Ben, I appreciate your enthusiasm for asking about whether Dr. Joel support a federal grant for me. I just want to invite all the viewers on my channel. I have a PayPal account. You can support my work directly. I'm just pointing that out, okay? And I do want to thank the generous donors to this channel who've given over and above. And I just, I thank God for you all, and I thank God for the people that God has brought my way to support my research, like Dr. Sanford over the last years, paid out of his own pocket. I'm eternally grateful for that. And I didn't have to go out there on the road trying to advocate. And, my effectiveness was not measured in how many souls I had witnessed to and who got saved. I was free to just explore, and I'm eternally grateful to Dr. Sanford for giving me that opportunity to research. And he I remember reporting to him once. I said, Dr. Sanford, this is high risk. I could come back and not find anything, and you're going to spend a year of my salary, and I'm just going to report a null result. He responded, he said, Sal, I know what high risk research is. You'll be fine. Because he developed the gene gun. That was very high risk research. If you look back at the history of it, you're just like, you got to be kidding. So,
I've been involved in plenty of high risk projects.
so describe some of your high risk projects. I mean, did any just go bust and you didn't get the result you're hoping? If you could share some.
Yeah. I can't say a whole lot about the current one I'm involved with. I'll just say this: it's I've been involved in a fairly speculative design to develop a new type of vaccine that's made in plants. And so I've had a technician and I have a couple undergrads who've been helping. I got dragged into this project. I'm not the creator of the project, but I've kind of been a little bit overseeing the project since we had a faculty member leave the institution. And really, it's just not worked out. It involves things like you have to splice in a particular gene into bacteria in order to get it into the plant, and then when you get in the plant genome, you have to show that it's there, and then you have to try to express that gene in order to make it actually make the product in the plant. And then you have to hope that it makes enough product that you can extract the protein, and then there's just so many steps, right? There's places to fail all along the way. And when I came into the project, they had kind of thought they were to some point, but they were always having a contamination problem. And I immediately looked at that and I said, I don't think that's I mean, well, no, they didn't realize they had a contamination problem. They thought they had positive results, but their control lane always had like the same band suggesting that this DNA fragment was in a place where it shouldn't be in the control. That's why we have run controls. Right? And I keep looking at that and say, you got to get rid of that band in that control lane, right? You got to throw out your PCR products. You got to throw out this kit or whatever. Something is wrong here. And but no, it seems like everything's working. It seems fine. There's just sort of some problem over here where maybe there's something in one of the solutions that's just showing that band. And I finally sort of basically wiped out the whole system and said, like, you got to start fresh with these chemicals, right? And then when that happened, all of a sudden the control no longer had that thing in it, but also the positive samples didn't have it either. And so all along, it really wasn't the product that we thought was happening, right? And that's like 6 months of going down some line of research where it's like, now this isn't going to work. We got to backtrack all the way, figure out where the first problem happened, where we were fooled into thinking we had positive results, and start over again and start working forward. And whether that'll happen or not, I don't know, because it was a lot of resource and it was a lot of time, and I'm not sure there's going to be the patience to do it again, because it is a long shot altogether anyway.
Yeah.
And so sometimes you take your shot, it's like, this didn't work a lot. You have to cut your losses at some point.
Right. And, that's just the way high risk research goes. If you succeed, you hit a home run. If you don't, you strike out. Using baseball analogies, you were mentioning earlier on one of my streams that your son was playing baseball. You attended his game. I said, I wonder if, before I forget, I know this is totally off topic. In that league, do they go extra innings if they're tied at the ninth inning?
That's a good question. It's never happened, so I don't know what the rule is. I haven't paid a close enough attention. Actually, I don't think they do.
Oh, okay.
Because it's junior varsity baseball, and when you're in junior varsity, it's sort of like we're just playing, and it's not for keeps. So I suspect it's like that's the end.
Because like the major league record was 20 innings, yeah. I think. They just could not break the tie. I've watched games like that grind on for six hours.
And if you're the loser, all that effort goes to seemingly waste.
So that had absolutely nothing to do with anything that.
Okay, but here's a lesson for you. I would never put a master's student, or even I wouldn't even put a PhD student on a project that had such high risk of failure.
Yeah.
These are projects where you pay a technician, you pay other people because it's part of a larger, grant or something. And maybe a PhD student plays a part in that, but they're not going to be like that's their sole project. because you don't want to put that on a student in terms of like they need some product. As a PhD student, you're going to have to contribute something to the field, and it's hard to come out with a completely negative result and
Right.
say I deserve a PhD for this. And so what I do as an advisor or as a committee member is it's very important for me when a PhD students get started and they're thinking about their projects is like, okay, you're going to propose X, Y, Z, right? Maybe three projects. They're interrelated to each other, but I want to see that project 1 and 2 has a high probability of success. You've got some preliminary data. You know whether you get, you might find out that you're wrong in your hypothesis, but that's actually information. That's not always nothing, right? You might be testing a hypothesis and now you have an alternative hypothesis. As long as it looks like you're going to collect the data and the data will be able to be interpreted in some way, it might be completely different than what you originally expected to interpret it, but of course that's what you should be doing. You shouldn't just have the answer and be like, I'm going to go find data to fit this answer. But you can't do something that's like based so much on some technology and then it doesn't work out and you can't even collect the data. And so it's very important to put a student in a position of success. I always want to walk away from that meeting where it's like, okay, we made a commitment. You said, here's what you're going to do. We agreed. That's good enough. If you do that, if you get these results and you come back to us in 2.5 years and defend that dissertation and you've done what we said we agreed was good enough, that dissertation defense is usually a very happy event. It's just like celebrating, it's a celebration of what you've done. Let's talk about it. What would you do differently? How are you going to explore this in the future? And it's great. That's why I never like to leave PhD students with like open-ended, like, hey, just go do some stuff and then come back and then we'll judge you to see whether we think you did enough.
That's great. Well, I wanted to tell you something. The anecdote that came to mind as you were describing even falsifying a null result. The most famous example is Michelson-Morley. Albert Michelson won the Nobel Prize because he couldn't find the ether, which was what he was seeking.
Yeah.
And I saw one biographer said he was actually just lamenting. And I'm just like, you're lamenting. You won the Nobel Prize, but you didn't find what you were wanting to find. And so it is a beautiful thing when you have an experiment, whether the result is what you're hoping for or not, it will be a valuable data point for the advancement of science. And so, I can imagine like trying to do some of these low energy nuclear reactions, quote unquote, cold fusion reactions. Like you don't throw that on a PhD chemistry student because your chances of success are so low. And it's, even among the community that believes in cold fusion, they acknowledge the success, the reproducibility rate is very low. Only a few experiments are very repeatable. NASA is getting into kind of that intermediate energy range, and they're able to repeat the experiment. So good on them. And then I saw some that, it's going down to the kilo electron volt. So it's not quite the low electron volts of cold fusion, but they're getting very close with some of these laser experiments on foams, and they're able to reproduce it. I'm just like, bravo. But that's what I call high risk research, where you might just draw a blank and but if
that's all a foreign language to me, but
I'm sorry. That's the one that's really close to my heart. So, some of these.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just about to say, so some of these where you're just gonna like do a measurement. I think that's great. You can't, in a sense, you're just hoping your equipment's good enough, and you're making a measurement. So I know one PhD student, he just put these sensors on turtles, these GPS track, and you're just gonna track the migration patterns, and here we report it. It's like, I think that's a chance for success. I think one particularly interesting experiment, I don't know that it was a dissertation, but it was a scientific experiment. They put these little migration markers on these. They're little identifiers. I guess you just put them on the bird's, leg or whatever you call it. And then they see where they migrate. It was the Arctic tern. They could go to different poles. They can go from the North to South Pole. And I think that that's a nice scientific experiment. You might have some success. If you're able to just, you don't have to come with any hypothesis. You're just having to say, okay, we're just trying to make a measurement of how far this bird can travel. We just want to confirm it. I think that was a very interesting.
I expect. I mean, I expect in the long run they have some kind of. There's different hypotheses about. Well, for one thing, there's this potential observation, right? They're confirming the potential observation, and then the question becomes, how do they do it, right? What are some of the mechanisms by which they can actually physiologically handle that particular trip? And so maybe they're exploring that. Mm-hmm. Because I do think of a PhD as something that advances, not just adding knowledge, not just adding facts, right, to the database, but it's adding ideas or testing ideas, adding to our breadth of not just the I'm struggling for words here, not just for knowledge, but I guess synthesis of knowledge, and causing us to have a better idea of how this world works, after we're done with that. So I usually expect a student, one of the primary things we ask as we're discussing, like say on an oral and then a written exam, is like, how well can the student actually come up with ideas and explore what their hypothesis is? Because a lot of students do want to do kind of what I call a fishing experiment. It's like, you can identify all the things in like a community, but what is your real interest? Like, why do you want to know, I guess would be the question. Like, why are you interested in that? And then make the student think through, like, well, why do I really care? Am I just doing this so that I can get the degree? No, it should be, I'm doing this because I'm interested in something about community ecology, because I'm interested in how I can preserve that community or something. They have to have some higher reason why I'm interested in the data itself, to make it worth exploring. And also when it comes down to money, you're like, if you don't have a question you're testing and something that is going to be of value when you're done, it's going to be hard to justify spending the money on that too.
There's one researcher who came on my channel. He's a Young Earth Creationist, Dr. James Carter, and he was relating his adventures as a grad student of 9 years. And my heart went out to him because he was in medical research and he was trying to synthesize artificial insulins. And I'm just like, my heart poured out to him because there were so many failures in constructing it. And there was no guarantee. I mean, there's no guarantee that he was, just like as you're describing, trying to build a vaccine. He was trying to build alternative insulins, and there's no guarantee you're going to succeed. You can only report, the way you would report a failure is like, okay, here we report that we used this technique and it was insufficient to give the desired result. And that might be your dissertation. You've advanced knowledge, and you have my total empathy that you spent 5 years to realize the devices and techniques could not achieve your aim. That is still valuable to know, because some other poor researcher will at least know not to do it that way. And those are the sort of dissertations that's like, well, you don't really have a victory march, but you have advanced knowledge.
No, I have certainly sat on dissertations like that.
Really?
And when but when that's happening, usually there's also another consideration. And sometimes that is what, I often want to know from the student when I engage with him about their dissertation is, what are your end goals in terms of, like, after your dissertation, what do you want to use it for? And partly what we're doing is we're sculpting your program in order for you to be successful later on. Now, if being successful later on means you did this very elaborate project and you had a great idea and it just didn't work out, right? The data didn't confirm your hypothesis, or your technique wasn't actually you weren't able to succeed with that particular technique, and you had a lot of negative data. You still have built in a compendium of knowledge, right?
Yes.
Actually, failure is often where you learn, right? Because when you fail, you have to try new things, and those are the most adaptable students. It's the students who come in with like their their faculty member has like, I've got this big grant and I need X, Y, and Z done. So you do this many samples, you do this, you get this data. I have this formula for a paper where, we just plug in that data. Here's the introduction. We'll write up like our conclusions with the data. You're going to get like a paper every 6 months out of this data set. A lot of those students come out of a dissertation and all they know how to do is go through the formula that they learned how to do.
Yeah.
And they're not independent thinkers. And
Right.
our program is a integrated biosciences program. And so you have to work outside your field. You have to have a project that actually incorporates multiple disciplines. So you have to have faculty members that are not just in biology, but like an engineer and a biologist, or maybe a geologist and a biologist are working together. Your project has to integrate those, because we think that's what future learners should be able to do, is be able to integrate knowledge and be able to cross disciplines.
So now I'm going to put you on the spot here, Dr. Joel. So you are a PhD. You're a PhD advisor. I didn't actually know that until I talked to you just now.
Yeah.
You actually help in the PhD program. So you know where I'm going.
I've been the director of the PhD program for a short period of time as well. So yeah, I have to deal with all the doctoral students and all their issues.
I got to ask you a pointed question, and it's on the behalf of my fellow Young Earth Creationists. Some of them are concerned. Some of them want to go through a PhD program because they do love biology. If you had a Young Earth Creationist would you be willing to accept the Young Earth Creationist as your PhD student if you were not doing Young Earth Creationist stuff? Because I know that for myself, I went through a graduate program, and I didn't have to do dissertations or anything. It was just kind of just classwork, and I don't think that they would have cared that much whether I was a Young Earth Creationist or not. And I know that there are some Young Earth Creationists there's some that are the advocacy type. And then there's some that are like, I just want to do medical research and I don't want to be in apologetics. Speaking for myself, I'm kind of in between. I obviously am passionate about Young Earth Creationism, but there's a part of me, it's like, I'd be interested to do work just because it's interesting scientifically. Like low energy nuclear reactions are fascinating to me. And I want to do research like that. So the reason I'm asking, I know that there's some of the viewers here that are looking at a PhD program. Would you feel comfortable receiving them if they were a certain kind of Young Earth Creationist? Like, let's say someone who's going to be a medical researcher. Would you feel comfortable mentoring them and bringing them up? So I put you on the spot. Answer it the way you wish, or you could say you don't feel comfortable talking about it publicly. Anything, But I'm actually asking on behalf of, because I have friends.
That's a really great question.
Yeah. Okay.
Now, and my answer is going to be very much like me personally, but I'll try to also give you some maybe larger perspective, like what I've seen in different programs. So my answer would be, for the most part, I would say I wouldn't have any problem having a Young Earth Creationist, work with me. It may depend a little bit on their specific interest, like their specific question, right? If they're coming into the lab and they were to say, my whole goal is to become a Young Earth Creationist to work at Answers in Genesis, and I want to dabble in some particular field in order to say I have expertise, but I'm not actually interested in learning about that, or I'm not willing to like see the data, write the data, and express it in a way that is as, I guess, fair to the day as possible. And it looks like it's just, I have an agenda and I'm using you. Well, then I'm not interested in that. But I certainly have had students that are Christians. Some have had probably Young Earth leanings initially. I wouldn't say they're Young Earth Creationists in the end. I do know Young Earth Creationists that have gone through graduate school. One of my fellow graduate students at the University of Tennessee was a very ardent young earth creationist, and she was doing molecular biology and really did excellent work. And that's the important key, is if you can do very good work, right? You're collecting good data and you're answering questions and you're addressing the data and you're writing it in ways that are appropriate. I guess being very neutral about it. I don't know how else to put it. Then you earn the respect of those who are around you. I think that's a great witness,
Yeah.
right? I think it's a fantastic witness. What I have seen, though, is I have seen a few young earth creationists who are extremely, I guess I'll say, belligerent in terms of like just making it really clear that all of you are wrong, and the only reason I'm here is just to prove you all wrong. Well, that personality type makes it really difficult to work with because they don't get along with any other students. They don't engage in the material, and you feel like they're not being. You have the sense they're not being honest with the data, even if maybe they are. They create a bias against them because of their attitude. But I've had other ones that are just wonderful to work with and around.
Well, I just, because this channel caters to graduate students and people looking for graduate level research. And I happen to know some young earth creationists who went through outstanding programs, best schools in the country. And the quality that helped them get through was, and I'm just trying to share this just for the benefit of you guys wanting to go into those areas, is they felt their calling was to do medical research. That's just a great area where maybe some of your views on origins. I mean, if you're helping to advance cures for diseases, you're going to be valued.
Yeah.
And you're going to be valued. I know someone who's
there are individuals that come through the program that are very difficult people to work with, not Christians, non-Christians who have wild and crazy views about other things that maybe everyone else in the program disagrees with. And yet they're so good at doing this particular thing, right? They're so professional at their actual position that you might kind of like, I don't want to associate with that person, or I disagree with their political views, or I really, that really drives me crazy. But I have to respect this particular aspect of what they're doing because that's the thing that we're awarding. We're not awarding the degree for their other views. We're rewarding it for the quality of that particular piece of work.
Yes.
Now, I'm not saying that there isn't incredible biases out there, right? There are arrogant people, there are obnoxious atheists, there are, and there are going to be people in some programs that won't be able to get over like a particular student's opinion on things. Now, there are ways to work around those types of things, but you have to be very cognizant of that.
I want to hold up someone like Dr. Joe DeWeese. He's a young earth creationist, but he was so good at topoisomerase. It's like you can't hold someone back like that because he's contributing to cancer research, and that's a big deal. And topoisomerase is a target of a lot of chemotherapies, and so a lot of research money and man hours has been invested in this. And so, yeah, Joe ends up being one of the best scientists who's a young earth creationist, but he's not in advocacy, but he's a great role model for other Christians who are young earth creationists. He's been great as a co-author for me, who's a little bit more in the public eye, that I can kind of be piggyback on an individual like that. So I'm just saying, if you're a young
you won't hear me say that young earth creationists can't do good science. And you hear some people saying that it's not possible. I think a lot of young earth creationists don't do good science, but it doesn't mean they can't do good science.
Right. And so I'm just saying, just as, for the young earth creationists there, it's like, one, it's some of the things that will solve young earth creationists models are in high risk areas. And speaking of Dr. Carter.
Yeah, there he is.
My mentor was Bill Langridge, a well-known scientist in the field of edible vaccines, but I still struggle to finally get potato plants to produce human insulin linked to a lectin carrier adjuvant. So, Dr. Carter, I think I said that you were 9 years in graduate school. If I got the figure wrong, apologies. But I was talking about some of the poor, I was
Oh, he
talking
said that
about poor
before.
Dr. Carter trying to build these insulins. So I was saluting your perseverance, sir.
I can totally relate to this because, as I mentioned earlier, I've been working on a project, mostly side project, on vaccine development. I'm no expert in that area, but I know enough now to know just how difficult what James Carter is describing here.
Wow.
Not trivial at all.
Talk about agony. So, um, so I'm just coming out and saying, okay, I appreciate the sentiments. We want more money thrown at Young Earth Creationism, but I've identified 2 research projects that I think are reasonably funded. One, the Flume of um, Steve Austin. That's practical. It's low risk in that whatever comes out of it will advance human knowledge. Whether we improve the yak model or not, it'll be valuable understanding to the behavior of sediments under turbulent flow of fluids. And I'm hearing geologists don't get involved in that too much. The next thing would be building interferometers, and the young earth community is totally not interested in that. I'll tell you where I was disappointed. I approached Jason Lyle. I said, I'm doing interferometry experiments to measure preferred speed of light, which is a one-way speed of light. And this interferometer was built by Cahill in Australia, and I just rebuilt it for under $4,000. Jason Lyle didn't respond to me. I'm just like, you could at least said hi or something. It's like, well, that's interesting, Sal. I don't,
I mean, he should be fascinated in that. He should be like jumping at the chance to test his own hypotheses.
Yeah. So
and find data that would support it. And you, as a scientist, you can't be scared to find out that you're wrong about something.
Right. I would have at least appreciated. It's like, well, I don't think it's measurable, and but didn't even respond to me. I was like, I think I'm one of the few young Earth creationists that actually tried to build experimental equipment to do stuff, and so where I was headed with this, that's a high risk experiment. There's no guarantee that we could build $100,000 interferometer and we're going to find something. It could be just a disaster for all we know, and nothing.
Do you need to run out of the room? Is that your place on fire?
No, I live near the fire station, so okay. I'm really glad we hung on long enough to get Dr. Carter here, and I was celebrating your perseverance, Dr. Carter. I think that would have killed me if I had to do what you did in graduate school. Because Dr. Carter had described the experiments and the procedures to building this, and I practically wept for you, Dr. Carter. I felt your pain, and I'm not even a chemist, and I could hear it. So maybe we could have another conversation sometime, Dr. Joel. I'm kind of running out of gas though, so yeah, maybe just as well as but you gave me a lot of information, and I hope. I think it's heartwarming to hear that you'd be willing to receive some Young Earth Creationists, because I actually might recommend some to you. And so that's why I asked that probing question.
I mean, at the very least, I'm more than willing to talk to somebody about programs and how to navigate.
There you go.
That. Even if it's just that.
Yeah,
I'm kind of winding down in my old age here in terms of actually I don't do a lot of research anymore.
Yeah.
Now, one of the joys I have is that I do sit on a lot of committees, so I get to sort of vicariously live through lots of other projects. And that's one of the great things about being a faculty member in a PhD program, is that I get to see projects in paleontology and genetics and ecology, and see like the nuts and bolts of it actually coming together, and actually seeing students defend and talk about the raw data, and then having it torn up. Like, we sit around and we just hash through, like, you didn't, you need to do this and this and this and this, and did you think about that? It's very stimulating. So that's the benefit of going through the whole process yourself, and then being able to be in the position of being able to just now sort of participate in that process, even if I'm not actively doing research myself as much.
Well, I'll tell you, just for the interest of some of the viewers, I want them to find a place where they can, if they're young Earth creationists, I want them to find a home where it's not too hostile and they have some probability of being able to get through the program. As and a lot of them that I've seen successful would be like a Joe DeWeese type. It's like, I have my views, but I'm really in it because I love the biology. I love the mission of trying to find cures for cancer. And I'd love to see more of these people matriculate through the system. And so that's one reason I was glad you're willing to answer that. Maybe they can look you up if they live, if they're willing to. That would mean meaningful to me to know that I can hand them off to someone like yourself. And
Well, yeah. Hey, I don't want to keep you forever. So, like I told you, like I said before, and I think most people here understand, I talk for a living. So if I get rolling, it's hard to stop me. So, but I so much appreciate you having me on. This was fun.
Okay, if you could comment on this one more thing by Dr. Carter here. I definitely learned more from my failures. One experiment I repeated 53 times, testing different variables before I figured out that young plants have PCR inhibitors and required an extra wash step.
And this is great. I can completely relate to this as well. I've done a lot of DNA extractions on a lot of different types of organisms, and there have been some really pesky ones, especially environmental samples, that have just, like, I've tried so many different kits, like different companies, tried all different things, different procedures, and then all of a sudden there's like this one little thing you didn't think about. If I had just done this at the beginning, this one, like he says, a wash step, there's an extra, do 70% ethanol at the end instead of 100%, and maybe that makes a difference. Yeah, sometimes that stuff drives you crazy.
Well, guys, we're shutting it down, and we weren't, too confrontational here. And, I tried to keep this under the flag of truce, and given our, our differing viewpoints, I'm really grateful for you coming. If coming on the show. After I end the broadcast, if you have just a few minutes afterward, Dr. Joel, that'd be great. And to all the viewers who joined us, both live and also in through recording, thank you very much. Special thanks to Dr. James Carter, who's lived through what we're trying to describe here. He's a young Earth creationist and survived academia. And I want to thank you, Dr. Carter, for being a role model to me. And Dr. Joel, thank you again. Take care, everybody, and God bless you all. Have a good night.